Fine. It's so lovely to see you all. And it's so lovely to be in Armidale virtually, though I was looking forward to it in person. I should also say that I'm honoured to be following in the footsteps of Kerry O'Brien, Matt Peacock, Jane Hudson, Tim Bowden, all of whom I'm proud to have worked alongside, along with close colleagues Fran Kelly, who you mentioned, who's finishing after many years at Radio National Breakfast, Geraldine Doog, Norman Swan, Robin Williams. I've been honoured to work in what I think is actually a jewel, one of the most important things that makes Australia work and needed more than ever, given the sort of paucity of the service being provided by commercial media. I want to also mention some other names, though, names you might not have heard of, one of whom, Helen Grasville, is here now, who's produced my stories on TV. Murray Travis, David Ford, Kerry Wheel, John Bruce, Leonie Highfield, Barbara Hewitt, Johnny Bwin, Fred Boston, Belinda Summer, Georgia Power. You will not have heard of those people, I think, but they're the people behind the scenes who race against time to make radio and television programs work while maintaining standards. All of them believe in the ABC, and all of them give far, far more than you'd expect from a 9-to-5 job. When I was working with Helen, she worked, let's say, 80 hours a week, making TV programs the best. I spoke with Brian about what I was going to say, and there was quite a bit. And then I realized there was nothing about me, which is a bit odd, because you need to know where I'm coming from. It reminded me of my first ABC job interview. It wasn't actually a job interview, it was a phone call. So I sent in an application for a vacancy. An ABC News executive, Ian Wolfe, rang me at the Commonwealth Treasury where I worked and said, "We've got to talk." We arranged a time, not at work, and I started spouting off all sorts of thoughts about how the ABC News could be better and truer to the ABC's mission. This was not the ABC, when I say Canberra, this was not the Parliament House News, but the local Canberra News, which dealt with a population of around 250,000. It's analogous to ABC New England Northwest. There are 53 such newsrooms across Australia. The ones near here, other ones near here, apart from Tamworth, are Port Macquarie and Muswellbrook. Now, I mention Muswellbrook because my wife, Tony, was the newsroom there. When I say she was the newsroom, in some places it's a one-person newsroom. She would get in early, update what she'd written, present the news, then spend the rest of the day out meeting people and writing it. She was embraced by the community, the new community for her, she's from Sydney, and became important to it. Later, she won a Walkley Award and a Human Rights Award for her reporting on the health of asylum seekers in detention, but she began in Muswellbrook. Sally Sara, my ABC Current Affairs colleague, began in Renmark in South Australia's Riverland. Later, she reported from Africa twice, Jakarta, India, Afghanistan, presented Lateline, and now presents The World Today. But she started in Renmark, being embraced by and reporting to her local community. No other organisation has anything like the presence of the ABC throughout Australia. I know this. Fairfax, now called Nine Entertainment, the organisation for which I worked until recently, has hardly any reporters away from 3 cities. Or no, it's got some in Brisbane and Perth. Otherwise, it's Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra. They have no one in Adelaide, no one in Hobart, no one in Darwin, none in inland Australia. Fairfax, Nine, the Sydney Morning Herald, relies on making phone calls. The ABC doesn't have to. It attends press conferences, it meets people When I was in Japan as the ABC's Tokyo correspondent, I got into a fight with the Adelaide Advertiser. The Adelaide Advertiser felt the need to support Mitsubishi, the local car plant. It insisted that my reporting from Tokyo about the head office's plans to shut the Adelaide office down was wrong. But it wasn't wrong. The Advertiser wasn't there. They didn't have the resources. I was there in Tokyo, talking to the executives, attending press conferences with a translator, a camera and a microphone, and reporting things back to Australia that newspapers couldn't. Like most of the Australian media, apart from the ABC, the Advertiser had little idea what was going on the ground. The ABC, as you might know, has staff in Port Moresby, Seoul, Jakarta, Tokyo, Bangkok, New Delhi, Nairobi, as well as Washington and London. It's expensive. And to get an idea of the expense, look at what the ABC's competitors do. Commercial TV, which a lot of us rely on, has usually 2 overseas bureaus in London and Los Angeles. A lot of what they do there is watching the TV and adding whatever value they can. Why Los Angeles rather than Washington, like the ABC? Well, not because things happen in Los Angeles, but because the time zone makes it easier to coordinate TV feeds with Sydney. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was on my lunch break, if you remember, away from the Treasury, talking to Ian Wolfe, the ABC executive, at 1,000,000 miles an hour, like I might have been now. He stopped me, slowed me down and said, "Tell me a bit about yourself," which is what I should do now before getting on to the substance of this talk, which is the responsibilities that come with working for the ABC. His key question was, why? "You're an economics graduate," he said. "You're at the heart of government decision-making, handling briefs that go to the Treasurer. Why would you want to leave that to report on local news?" I told him it was because, and these were my words, it was the most fun you could have. I'd worked in commercial radio, community radio, and also the most important job there was. Later at another time, when I was sort of being more open, I told him about the ABC and me. How as a child in Adelaide, I'd wake up before 6 o'clock, go to the kitchen and hear the ABC test tone come on. Then the sound of a kookaburra, then the national anthem, then the first programs, which were readings from the Bible and English for New Australians. About how later, when I was allowed my own radio in my own bedroom, it glowed at night. It had valves. I'd leave it on all night. The volume would be turned down because it was my friend. When I went mentally through a list of things that I'd save if ever the house was on fire, I always envisaged me carrying out of the house my friend, the Bakelite Stromberg Carlson radio. And that was the only thing I imagined saving. There were the radio plays. There were programs like Late Night Live that took me somewhere else. In the case of plays where TV plays couldn't, in the case of, it was called Late Line then, took me to other thoughts about the world. I would cycle into the city every week to get the next ABC radio program guide. It was all typed out, which is odd because it was always the same as the one before. When I went to university, I chose as subjects ones I thought would get me into the ABC. I chose drama because I thought I might make radio plays. I chose politics. I thought I might be a reporter on ABC Radio Current Affairs, and economics because it was exciting and no one seemed to know what was going on. I abandoned the others, concentrated on economics. The Treasury asked me to come to Canberra, and let's put it this way. When I left the Treasury to go to the ABC, a colleague wrote on my farewell card, "Now you'll be a round peg in a round hole." I spent most of my time at Treasury working on the public radio station 2XX, as did Guy Debelle, now a Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank. I described it in a piece I wrote about him when he got the job. I said, On Friday nights in the late 1980s at around 11, a long-haired Treasury official used to slip into a chair in what was probably the grottiest collection of radio studios ever attached to a university campus. At the northern end of the Australian National University, the brown carpets were mouldy and coffee-stained. The programming was vinyl albums in blue crates, and so on. I presented the news. The local news, which, like when I was describing ABC Muswellbrook, I collected. I phoned people. I got to know the members of the ACT House of Assembly. I went to their meetings. I cycled to Queanbeyan every month to attend meetings of the local council. I lived and breathed the place where I lived because I thought it was important to tell people about it. I'd cycle around Canberra carrying my portable typewriter. Let's see if I can do this. And my portable tape recorder in my pannier bag. When I applied for a job at the ABC, I typed up a transcript of their local news for that Monday morning, then one of mine for the same morning on 2XX, making the point they were both prepared under the same constraints with the same aims. And I didn't think it would get me the job. I thought it would annoy them. It did. Ian Wolfe was thrilled, although less so when he asked me to send him a tape of my voice. He called me back, and it would be fair to say he was disheartened. He thought, well, maybe we can work on that if you get the job. I thought there was no higher calling than telling people what was in the news. I moved to Sydney and worked on those other places I mentioned. Then I arrived at ABC Radio Current Affairs, the unit that makes AM, PM and the world today. Now, I want to tell you two sets of things. One is what I learned about how to make radio programs there. And the other are the more important lessons I absorbed informally, sort of by osmosis. And we know these lessons, and we know them, I think, partly because we've grown up in Australia, grown up with the extraordinary thing that is the ABC. The executive producer of PM, Kerry Wheel, she was one of the names I mentioned, unsung names earlier, alluded to it one night. She was getting cross with us for not doing something correctly. "You're just caretakers," she said. "What does that mean?" we said. She said, "We're all caretakers." What were we taking care of? We were taking care of a set of traditions that are the ABC's own. There are no programs like AM, PM and the world today on the BBC or anywhere else. Sort of format that distinguishes them, but other things as well that I'll mention. They're unopinionated. They're engaged, highly engaged. They're fast and up to the second. I remember listening to PM one afternoon while sitting on the steps of the National Library in Canberra. I couldn't go into the building because I was just mesmerised by what I was hearing. The presenter, Hugh Evans, was talking to the Parliament House reporter, John Highfield, about what had been transpiring in Parliament House that afternoon. It was immediate. It had just happened. The newspapers would present it later and differently. They'd filter it. This was unfiltered, yet with the context added in real time, explaining why it mattered, delivered off the cuff without wasting words. Now, Fran Kelly does that every morning on ABC Radio National Breakfast. Fran used to be in a band. She was in the Flinders University Choral Society when I was at university. She became a reporter for Triple J, initially specialising in music, then an ABC sports reporter, and then she joined me in ABC Radio Current Affairs. Now that style, the style you hear from Fran, the style in our programs, can seem impolite, especially if you're putting yourself in the shoes of the person being interviewed rather than a listener's shoes. That's because we do not waste the listener's time. For AM and PM, the interviews are edited, the recorded ones, to make them more concise. We cut out the ums and ers. We used to do it on tape. I have here my cutting block. I used to have ridges on my thumb from all of the cuts. 1 second was 7.5 inches, and we could adjust the cuts to within 1/4 of an inch. The questions are part of theatre. They're more than merely questions. We were told to ask the question, get the answer, then jump in before the interviewee went on to the next point so we could ask about it. So we'd be creating this back and forth, this theatre, this Punch and Judy show. And the questions had to be questions. The shorter, the better. Kerry O'Brien once joked to me that he couldn't do an interview that was 2 minutes because that was the length of his questions. Anyway, we had to be the shorter, the better. The best question, we were told, is one word: why? We're told in one instance, instead of putting to someone allegations about tax avoidance, which might sound opinionated, just ask, do you pay your taxes? Sometimes, often with politicians, especially these days, I find Americans are great. They answer questions, but politicians, Australian politicians, seem to have been to a school where they avoid it. You repeat the question. Paul Murphy, the presenter of PM, explained his rule that you never repeat more than twice. After someone has heard the same question asked 3 times, someone gets it. It's not going to be answered. The politician is playing the part of an idiot who didn't hear. You don't need to say anything. You just move on. Radio is different from newspapers and really from television in a way. Television is like deep diving. People decide to watch the TV and they give themselves over to it. Radio is usually on in the background. Newspapers, people make a conscious decision to read. It's not on in the background. And in newspapers, people can pass over stories that don't interest them. In radio, it's on. And the only way of escaping something that's boring is to turn off. That's why we keep our pieces short on those programs, 2.5, 3 minutes. And they need to be written much more precisely. I found that I was given much more leeway, for bad writing in newspapers. Newspapers are non-linear, which is the new sort of buzzword, but, they always have been. Someone doesn't get a sentence, they can go back and read it again, go to the end of a review, see what the reviewer thought, cast their eye back to who was that person. Radio is unforgivingly linear. It's like a ladder. Each step of the argument is built on the one before it and can't refer back more than a rung. If it does, the whole thing, if you have to do that, the whole thing will break down. You should, I was told, imagine you're writing for a grandmother who has the radio on in the kitchen while she's talking or thinking about a daughter who's about to visit, making a cake, and is deaf. If you can get through to her, you've done your job. And because of developing events throughout the day, there's very little time for you to do it, for you to do the work preparing the piece. Okay, that's the formal part of the job. If you like, that's part 1 of the lessons I learned. And I'm just going to lean over and plug in this computer before it acts on its warning and breaks down. Good, now we can hear the second part. The informal lessons, the ones that are the most important. These are the lessons I've taken away. And as I said, they've been conveyed through osmosis. Others mightn't think about them in the same way. One is, you could follow the formula I mentioned, and it's a format, and be an appalling radio current affairs reporter, a travesty to the responsibility that has been placed on you. You could engage people, you could entertain them, and merely tell them what they already knew or suspected. You hear it all the time. You hear it too much. The Treasurer said today, Labor slammed the proposal. We're in the 30th, 50th, I don't know, day of lockdown. Access to the airwaves is a privilege, and time is the use of time is the ultimate privilege. Time is non-renewable, like nothing else. To waste time, to waste the airwaves, is to waste them forever. In my view, it's unforgivable. Academics say you should make every moment a teaching moment. Well, in a way, I think you should too. The people given the opportunity, entrusted with the responsibility of using the airwaves on behalf of the ABC, have the ability to give people something extra, to expand their way of thinking about things. Maybe just a little bit. Now, I'm not talking about propaganda any more than he said, she said, which can easily be propaganda if you have the wrong balance of he said or she said. I'm talking about showing people a different way, a sliver of a different way of thinking about something, telling them something that they didn't know, planting a seed. Now, I've tried to do that all the time, really. I've always tried to use the opportunity to say more than people already know. I cottoned onto this idea in 1969. I was a lot younger. I was watching commercial TV news in Adelaide. A group of anti-Vietnam War activists had announced plans to burn a dog, a named dog. They put a photo of it in the newspaper. Burn a dog with kerosene at the university. They were protesting at the use of napalm in Vietnam. The TV news, they turned up. They reported that night that it had been called off. The protesters had listened to, the pleas of, people like me. I would have been one of them, and said, no, they don't need to do that to make the point. The TV news that night was standard up until the end. It reported what the people had said, people for and against, the formula, showed vision of the meeting where they announced they wouldn't do it. And that's where it could have stopped. But the editor or the reporter did something else. After the last words, the camera lingered on the ground on a flyer, piece of paper, and as someone walked over it. And the discarded piece of paper read, "Napalm burns people." That stayed with me. That planted a seed. It didn't preach. It didn't tell me what to think. It just gave me an idea that there was perhaps a different way of looking at things than other people did. I've tried to do it in talk about the Australian dollar, in talk about the current account deficit, just telling people that maybe the current account deficit wasn't, the disaster that we thought it was in the 80s. It got much worse after it turned out not to be a disaster. It doesn't exist now. We've got a current account surplus. No one's noticed the difference. But to try and give people those ideas. When employers complained, every national wage case, that increases in the minimum wage would cost jobs, the union said they wouldn't. I said on PM, well, there are these two cool dudes. They're economists, David Card and Alan Kruger. They took advantage of a natural experiment in the US when the state of New Jersey lifted the minimum wage and the neighbouring state of Pennsylvania didn't. And they discovered that jobs, minimum wage jobs in the fast food industry remained unaltered. Actually, they increased slightly in the state that boosted the minimum wage. They were rubbished at the time. I thought it was sort of worthwhile because it was a natural experiment, and hey, I could let people think that maybe things aren't as straightforward. 10 days ago this month, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for their work. Well, one of them's passed on. The other one was awarded the Nobel Prize. Leaving people with something more, enlarging their view of the world, is, in my view, honouring a sacred trust. But it's hard. It takes time to tell people something they don't already know, and it takes less time to tell people something they already know. And when you're counting seconds, that matters. To tell people something they haven't suspected, unless it's done really cleverly, like the way I was describing, you need to build a whole infrastructure. And one way of doing it is to tell people, give people just little bits of an idea at a time. It's much easier in newspapers, as I said, there's more space. It was the approach I took at The Age, where I was economics editor, the approach I take now at The Conversation, where we unlock the insights of academics about the news of the day. Not to be confused with the ABC radio program Conversations, by the way. I strongly recommend you, The Conversation, type it in, you can sign up and get a daily newsletter, which will do this. Now, I said I'd tell you about the informal lessons I got from working at the ABC. The second one is that you, the broadcaster, matters more than you will ever fully know. I got inklings of this at AM and PM when people would ring me and talk as if they knew me, as if I was their friend, as if I meant a lot to them. Now, this doesn't happen as much with TV. Humbling, when you get that full recollection, that's the way to describe it. Some of these people were stuck at home. They were retired, didn't get to see many people. I provided, bouncily sharing my insights, what there's a movie about a radio announcer, 1984 movie called Comfort and Joy, done by the man who made Local Hero, Bill Forsyth. I provided, as did that radio announcer, comfort and joy without meaning to. Now, in my view, not doing that is as much a waste as not providing new insights. Many good broadcasters can do it innately, but it can be and has been taught. I was taught it by Arch McCurdy. Now, you probably remember him, Relax With Me in the 60s and 70s at night time. He was one of the best broadcasters there was. When I arrived at ABC Sydney in the 1980s, he was Director of Presentation. His job was to make us human, ideally slightly more than human, because radio has a sort of flattening effect by the time it's received at the other end. He took me on, he took Norman Swan on, he took Geraldine Doog on, he took Fran Kelly on. He taught us how to talk naturally. And the secret is something akin to making love to one member. Pick one member of the audience. You just need to be true to one person. We'd be told to put the microphone the width of a fist between our lips and then imagine a personal friend. It was my mother, Margaret, always for me. And then to talk to that person, to talk as if you value that person, as if they're clever, interested, they mightn't know about the topic, but you want to tell them why it matters because they would be interested. He taught us how to read, not in groups of words, but to read as I'm doing now, which is to look at a phrase, take it in, internalize it, and then for it to come out. While often you're looking somewhere else, you're not looking at the words, you are not reading words. Geraldine Doog, in an obituary I wrote for Arch McCurdy in 2013, said, told me for him, and he changed the way of talking at the ABC. The ABC people used to talk like British radio announcers, very formal. It was about your brain as much as his voice, she said. His contention was that you had to remove every barrier between yourself and your audience. You had to let people see who you were. And to do that, quote, you had to like who you were. So he worked on our psychology as much as anything else. The final thing I've absorbed over the years is that the ABC's airwaves belong to the public. Commandeering them to express your own point of view is theft. Alan Jones, Ray Hadley, maybe even Philip Adams are in a different position. But Lee Sales, Fran Kelly, and myself don't do that. To do that is an abuse of trust. Four Corners does not come into this, because Four Corners is, if you like, a massive research job. It's like publishing a book. It's like discovering everything about something and putting forward the conclusions you made. And, you know, those conclusions are usually harsh, but it's not an exercise in someone stating a predetermined opinion. So my 3 lessons boil down to not wasting the airwaves, give people something extra, don't waste the opportunity, offer them friendship, and don't steal the airwaves. Now, you'll hear about how the ABC is under threat. That is true, but it has enormous and growing strength deriving from those innate things. I think they're, you know, the core. It doesn't give people, it doesn't tell people what to think. It's carved out a space in social media hugely by being reliable. We now have more people absorbing ABC material and more young people than ever before. Most months it's the most read news site. Until 1939, it took its news from newspapers. A man called Keith Murdoch lobbied all he could. He was head of the Herald Group, lobbied all he could to stop it setting up its own news operation. He said it would be encroaching on newspapers' turf. It did do so. Then in the 1990s, the man who hired me, Ian Wolfe, quietly set up ABC News Online. Without it, we would be lost. Rupert Murdoch, his son, hates it because it's encroaching on the newspaper turf. It is putting news sourced in far better ways than News Limited or Fairfax or whoever could ever do, putting that in print in competition with them. Now, I know how threadbare commercial media has to be these days. The advertising has dropped away. Without the ABC expanding, well, I suppose first into TV, now into online, and carrying news with it, Australians would have been bereft in the bushfires. Australians would have been bereft in COVID. Australians are right to depend on the ABC, and the people who work for the ABC should never forget the obligation that imposes on them.